Greg Johnson, Managing Director of Equity and Economic Opportunity at the Rockefeller Foundation. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of RF Breakthrough, How Mayors Are Tackling the Racial Wealth Gap. The racial wealth gap is wider for Black and Latinx families compared to white families than for any other racial identifications. Nationwide, the problem persists across a variety of assets, including housing, businesses, and retirement accounts. Boston University's 2021 Menino survey of mayors report on closing the racial wealth gap found that the majority of America's mayors, just over 2/3 of them, are concerned about racial wealth gaps in their cities. The Menino Survey of Mayors is the signature effort of the Boston University Initiative on Cities, founded by Mayor Tom Menino after he left office. The survey is currently the most prominent and authoritative survey of American mayors, providing insights into the opportunities and challenges faced by U.S. cities today. The Rockefeller Foundation, in collaboration with City Community Development, first supported the survey in 2018, and the work has been quite successful. To discuss the most recent report, joining me today are Mayor Libby Schaaf, the 50th mayor of Oakland, California, and Professor Katherine Einstein, Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston University. Welcome. So, Katherine, I'd love to get our conversation started with you today. I'd love, Professor Einstein, if you could help us frame today's discussion by sharing with us that in the 2021 Menino survey, we found that the majority of America's mayors, just over 2/3 of them, are concerned about the racial wealth gaps in their cities. However, your team also found significant differences in the views depending on the type of city and the political party of the mayor in those cities. Can you speak to some of these distinctions?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've been running this survey for nearly a decade. And one of the things that we always do when we ask any type of question is we check to see whether there are differences by mayor's partisan identification, by city size, by median household wealth, by racial demographics, right? So we check all of these different things. And one of the aspects that really stood out when we asked mayors about the racial wealth gap was just how big the partisan gap was. And partisanship doesn't shape every question that we asked mayors. So this year we also asked a bunch of questions about homelessness, and there actually weren't really big partisan gaps in how mayors thought about and approached homelessness. But when it came to race, we actually found a 50 percentage point gap in mayors' willingness to acknowledge the racial wealth gap. So 80% of Democratic mayors think that the racial wealth gap is a problem in their cities, compared with only 30% of Republicans. And I think this really, unfortunately, mirrors the divides that we're seeing at the national level on racial justice issues. We really do see a big difference in the national political parties in their willingness to acknowledge racial gaps and racial and differences in outcomes by racial groups.
Wow, no, this is so helpful. Mayor, I'd love to turn to you now just to talk a little bit about, we hear these vast distinctions. And so I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about whose job it is to educate the American public about the importance of closing the racial wealth gaps. And I wonder if you'd push a little bit further and talk about, as mayors, you are leaders who are closest to the people, and that the local level is often the right place to have many of the most difficult conversations that we face as a country. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about what the importance of public opinion is in shaping equity-based policies around closing the racial wealth gap, and how do we help people understand the impact of policy on populations of people?
First of all, it is everyone's job to educate the public about why closing the racial wealth gap benefits everyone. When you're at the city level, as mayors, we see painfully every day how having huge swaths of our community systemically prevented from contributing their talent, their labor, their effort, we all suffer from that disparity. And when you look at the quantifiable disparities, like this data does not lie, it shows that we have a systemic blockage to having all Americans enjoy what is supposed to be our God-given right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. And mayors, we play a unique role because we are so close to the people, because we fly at that altitude where when we experiment in our cities, it does have national significance, but we actually know the people. We can tell the stories. Because at the end of the day, to really shift national or even statewide policy, we have to talk to both the head and the heart. The head needs great data. And cities like Oakland and St. Paul are doing rigorous evaluations of things like guaranteed income so that we can collect a body of evidence that makes the compelling case about why this has the best return on investment for the American dollar of any other strategy. But the second part of our work that's so important is narrative change. Until the collective consciousness sees that we don't need to buy into a zero-sum mindset, that when other people do better, we all do better. When we lift up our most vulnerable, it actually helps everybody. And telling stories, telling the story of Alicia Rowe. She is in our guaranteed income demonstration right now called Resilient Families. She has experienced homelessness in the past. She is the sole guardian of her grandson. Guaranteed income has improved her health. Her anxiety and stress level has gone down. It's allowed her to start improving her credit score. Credit scores are things that can help or hurt you rent an apartment or get a job. She has opened up a college savings account for her grandson. And you should see the pride in her eyes when she talks about that. And she even has found the time and the energy to volunteer at a food pantry to help those who are even more vulnerable than she is. Again, the dignity of being able to contribute and give back to her community. So those stories, as well as the clear data that things like a guaranteed income are not just money in someone's pocket. Stockton's results show us that people are twice as likely to actually move from partial to full employment. People work more when they get a guaranteed income. And their mental health goes from literally a level of on the brink of being clinically mentally ill to a place of comfort and functionality. That is a great investment, both for our heads and our hearts.
This is absolutely amazing, the concept of putting community interest first, and that when you support the most vulnerable in our communities, that it actually lifts the entire community from where we are to where we need and want to be. I'm so excited that we also have Mayor Melvin Carter, the 46th mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, who's implementing an unapologetic equity-based agenda there, who's also joining the conversation. Mayor Carter, welcome. I wondered if you'd want to add or contribute anything to the concept of how do we help people understand the impact of policy on populations, and particularly how do we help people understand the impact of policies that are intended to get rid of, to alleviate the racial wealth gap in our communities and our country?
Well, listen, thanks for having me on. I'm excited for this conversation. I could sit here and listen to my friend Mayor Schaaf talk all day long because she's hitting the nail right on the head. This is really critical. The way we think about all of this is just about every aspect of how our American life is organized is a result of policy decisions that we've made, investments that we've made, and investments that we've failed to make as a community. And so when we see families, when we see children whose life outcomes are better predicted by their zip code than by their GPA, when we see that over and over and over again, when we see disparities all across our country that limit our children's chances at life before they're even born, when we see people in our communities who are homeless, who don't have food to eat, all of those things, they're all results of policy decisions that we've made at some level. We as cities sadly don't have the large chest of resources that our federal government and our states have to be able to address some of these at scale, which is one of the reasons that we've taken the leadership to say we're going to launch these types of pilots to just start to demonstrate how some of this stuff can be different. I know with guaranteed income, and Mayor Schaaf was talking about our guaranteed income pilots, and with college savings accounts and with a lot of the other things that we're doing, people look and say, well, that's different and that's unusual. But that's sort of the point. What's the same and usual in America is families locked in poverty. What's the same and usual in America is families stuck in a revolving door where they don't know where they're going to sleep tonight or how they're going to feed their children tonight. And so whenever somebody says, look, this is a strange and unusual approach to poverty alleviation, I feel like maybe that means we're finally getting somewhere.
Wow. Listen, this is so interesting. Professor Einstein, I wonder if you help us contextualize some of what the mayors are saying, because what they're proposing are very specific things that we can do to help develop better policies, right? But we know that from the survey that mayors who believed that the racial wealth gap was a problem in their cities were almost unanimous in supporting generic racially targeted programs, such as support for Black and Latino small business ownership and home ownership. But when you asked about specific programs like universal basic income or reparations, their support was a lot more muted. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, right. So first, I actually want to stress it's actually surprising in some ways that such a large proportion of mayors endorsed homeownership and small business programs that were expressly targeted towards Black and Latino people. I think it really reflects the importance of those policy areas in driving the racial wealth gap and increased acknowledgement of the racial wealth gap in cities. So we took those results to be sort of real progress in the way that city leaders are talking about these important issues. But as you point out, there is considerably more willingness to support those sort of more generic programs than there is to support specific reparations or guaranteed income or universal basic income programs. So, I want to think about this in a few different ways. And the first is that in some ways, it's actually really surprising that roughly 4 in 10 mayors were supportive of reparations programs or universal basic income programs. In many ways, those programs would have been politically unthinkable, maybe even 10 to 20 years ago in most communities. And so hearing about the number of different cities that are now exploring those different policies suggests really, I think, a growing political acceptance of this. But I think it's also important, and the mayor's responses reflect this, that the politics of these types of programs is really tricky. In many big cities, we're comfortable now acknowledging racial wealth gaps, and we're comfortable to some extent acknowledging the policies that have contributed to it. But we also know, looking at public opinion data, that racially targeted programs remain largely unpopular among many groups. And just as sort of a general rule, when we're looking at public opinion data about policies, programs that target people by class tend to be more popular than race-targeted programs, and universalistic programs tend to be more popular than both. And so I do think that those sort of realities of public opinion create challenges even for mayors who are deeply passionate and deeply committed to tackling the racial wealth gap.
Mayor Carter, I'd love to come to you to follow up to that framing that Professor Einstein just shared and ask that we dig into some particular constituencies based on that, right? Because when we were targeted in talking about race, mayors became much more muted. So we often talk in broad terms as universality is more acceptable. So we often talk in broad terms about the racial wealth gap, but are there specific constituencies you are focused on supporting? Women, people with criminal records, Latinos, Blacks, etc.?
Look, political messaging is one thing. If we look and just say, what happens when we put those layered kind of heat maps down on our cities? And in St. Paul and in Portland and literally every city in the country, we can map African-American populations, we can map Native populations, we can map Latino populations, we can map low-income communities of color all over the country. Just by looking at statistical heat maps on just about anything you want to choose. one of the reasons I went into politics in the first place is because Minnesota is this incredible state. We're a home ownership state. We're an education state. We're a healthy state. We're an employed state. We're all of these things that we're really proud of. And at the same time, we have some of the worst disparities in the nation between our communities of color and our white Minnesotans in literally every single one of those spaces. So I think when I was 26 and I decided I wanted to run for city council the first time, I ended up telling a group of people, I love Minnesota so much, I want some of it in my neighborhood. And so what ends up happening is, and I think this is one of the reasons we're stuck in these cycles of poverty and disparity as a country, because what ends up happening is we say, hey, look, there's a real problem. We are failing Black and brown children. We are failing Latino children in this area, in this part of town. It's very predictable and it's very consistent across the country. And then we say, let's bring this solution and say, okay, we're going to target it to low income families in this zip code. And it just doesn't match from an implementation science perspective. And so, again, we have to think about the political messaging to get something through our city councils and our state legislatures and things like that. But hopefully, and I think what we're trying to drive is to say, wait a minute, let's bring a solution that matches the problem that we're actually trying to solve. And when we have race explicit problems, when we can look and say, listen, we can disaggregate, we can control for income, we can control for education, we can control for all of these other factors and still see a very powerful race effect in home ownership and in just literally across the board, that means we have to address race. There's just no way around that if we really are intent on solving these challenges and solving these problems. And so that's something that I think we have to be intentional about. That's something we have to be honest with ourselves about. And that's something that is going to require, I think, not just politicians sort of following polls to tell us what people are thinking right now, but it's something that's going to require politicians being willing to provide thought leadership, willing to bring people along, willing to have long form conversations. Right here in St. Paul, some of the things that we're doing, from eliminating late fines in our public libraries to launching college savings accounts for every child born in our city to piloting guaranteed income, those are things that, 5 years ago, our whole community may not have really had their mind wrapped around. And we've had to have big conversations about why these things are important and how these types of measures, which help low-income Black and brown families put money in their pockets and put food on the table, why these things help address some of the macro challenges that we experience as a city, we experience as a community. And so absolutely, we're targeting, low-income families. We're targeting, not just single moms, but families who have young children born. And we're being really intentional about telling folks where our COVID relief funds are concerned, where our guaranteed income pilots are concerned, that these funds are going to be intentionally focused on eliminating the racial disparities that we've experienced in St. Paul for far too long.
Wow. Listen, this is so powerful to think about. The reason that we're designing the programs that we are is because the solutions need to address the systemic issues that exacerbate, prolong the issues that we're trying to address. So, Mayor Schaaf, I'd love to come to you.
That's right. If we're still stuck, Greg, and that's all, if we're still stuck in a phase of trying to solve race explicit challenges with race implicit solutions, then we'll be stuck here for a really long time.
I cannot have said it better. It's why you're the mayor and I'm the moderator. Mayor Schaaf, I'd love to turn to you really quickly and ask, as we talk about designing these solutions that address the issues, right? You and Mayor Carter are both members of Mayors for Guaranteed Income, a movement for guaranteed income as a tool for both racial and gender equity. And I love the example that you shared earlier from Ms. Rowe and how it changed things in her life for the better. I was wondering, you've deployed pilots in your cities and you've provided qualified families, certain amounts of dollars per month for at least 18 months. Can you tell us more about these programs and any other results to date? And would love to hear more examples like Ms. Rowe's story, because I think that the more we can amplify, again, how useful and instrumental this is in helping people to establish economic stability for themselves, but also to begin to discern a path to economic mobility that allows them to create wealth for themselves, their families, and their communities is really important to stress.
Well, thanks, Greg. I mean, Some of our government programs are well-intentioned, but they literally make poverty a full-time job and rob people of their dignity and give them the impression that they are problems with deficits rather than people that have the will and the intelligence to chart their own path to self-sufficiency. And I'll give you an example of when this really kind of hit home for me. We also are really struggling with homelessness in Oakland, housing insecurity. Anyone who lives in the Bay can tell you that the price of housing is cray-cray here. There's just no other word for it. And so we designed a homelessness prevention intervention. And one thing that was different is in the past, people have always helped pay the rent or, paid rent directly to the landlord. And for the first time, we deployed flexible emergency funding. And I'll tell you when it really it meant so much to me that this flexibility is so important, and that is what is baked into guaranteed income. One of our very first families, we all think we know what a family looks like, but we don't. They are not ubiquitous. And one of our first families was an adult man who was developmentally disabled, who was the sole caretaker of his very elderly mother. And they had fallen behind on their rent and all their bills because the man had lost his job. But we learned that he lost his job because he had to wear a uniform to his work. Now, he was able to maintain employment enough to support himself and his mother with this job, but the family washing machine had broke. And he was unable, due to his disability, to navigate a public laundromat. And so not only did we pay their back rent and their utility bills that were owed, but we bought the family a new washing machine so that he could get his job back and stay employed and stay self-sufficient. Now, I don't know of any government programs that buy washing machines. And the point is that we don't know what a family needs to get to self-sufficiency. Every family is going to be completely unique. And then I have to add, Greg, talking about racially intentional, which I completely agree with everything that my dear friend Melvin just said, who I admire so much. But in California, we have an added challenge that Prop 209 actually prohibits governments from doing any race-based programs. And so to all of you who are in philanthropy out there, this is why we have really relied on private money so that we can do race targeting and that we do look for other proxies like income, like geography, to target our programs in a way that is not explicitly race-based because we are legally prohibited from doing so. And so this is a real thing that we have to continue to confront. Californians had an opportunity to actually remove that prohibition by a ballot initiative, and unfortunately it lost. So we have a lot more to do, even in the so-called progressive state of California.
Wow. Mayor Carter, I'd love to provide you also an opportunity to talk a little bit about any of the results to date that you're seeing from the programs that you're implementing.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the most important question is what are the results? And one of the things that excites me about what Mayor Schaaf just said, one of the things that excites me about this work is to insert independent third-party evaluation into this work. Too much of our anti-poverty work, too much of our public safety work is centered around what somebody's favorite uncle said as a kid, as opposed to thinking about what is the data telling us, what are the statistics telling us. It really makes me understand that as we talk about the war on science, it's much more than just around climate. It's around all of the things that we do, all of the critical things that we have to do as a country. This space in particular, where we're talking about guaranteed income, this space is full of racist tropes about what sort of quote unquote those people will do if you give them money. And one of the things that really excites me about this is for everybody who's actually interested in actual data, we're disproving all of those tropes. St. Paul is the second city to launch a guaranteed income pilot in our country. Stockton was the first under Mayor Schaaf and our good friend, former Mayor Michael Tubbs. And the evaluation that they did there found that one, what families do with it is that they get some groceries, they pay the rent, they get a new washing machine, they do the same types of things that you and I would do in our families, because what we're learning is there's no such thing as those people. There's no such thing as they. There's just one big us. There's just one big we. And we're part of this humanity together. One of the incredible findings that we found is that the people who have received this benefit, and one of the biggest critiques that we get is sort of this, like, why would people work anymore if there's free money to be found? Now, we're doing $500 a month, and no one I've heard say that would ever be able to quit their job for $500 a month, but that's a different conversation. One of the incredible findings around in Stockton's demonstration project, which we're excited to see if we can demonstrate in other places as well, is that the people who received the $500 monthly benefit actually transitioned into full-time employment, actually gained employment at a rate significantly higher than the people who didn't. That's sort of surprising until you start asking the questions why. It's things like the story that Mayor Schaaf just told. It's the folks who say, well, I could finally put my child in childcare to be able to go work for. I could finally buy that suit so I could go to an interview. I fixed up my truck so I could get across town. There's so many different ways in which unlocking in just the power of a little bit of cash, really a relatively very small amount of cash, can unlock people's economic potentials. And it brings us full circle to this realization, and this is where we started, Greg, that people aren't poor because they lack character. They're poor because they don't have enough money. And, one of the things that shocks me as people look and say, this shocking, kind of incredible type of approach, is that we're 60 years in America into a war on poverty, and giving money to poor people still feels strange and unusual. That in and of itself is a striking condemnation of everything that we've done in the past. So we're excited around this. St. Paul, we launched with CARES Act funding a pilot that provided, again, $500 a month for a period of 18 months to a cohort of 125 families. That pilot just wrapped up, so we're looking forward to getting the evaluation results from that. We're also launching a second pilot that ups the ante to 300 families, $500 a month for a period of 24 months. We're going to continue to push this conversation. We're going to continue with over 60 mayors in the country who are part of Mayors for Guaranteed Income, with dozens of pilots either underway already or in planning phases right now around the country. We're going to continue to push this conversation. We're going to continue to create the data that we need to have a real conversation about what a policy like this, which has been implemented in other places around the country, which was a strong part of Martin Luther King's teachings, that some policy like this will be required to eliminate poverty in America, of what a policy like this will actually do on the ground, so we can eliminate those racist tropes that have stood in between us and the types of policy that Americans deserve.
The mayor just helped us understand that poverty is the intended consequence of conscious policies, and that we have to design policy solutions and also get independent third-party evaluation, right? So that we can substantiate with data, right, that actually when people get income, they spend it on food, housing, and washers, right, and dryers, so they can live with some dignity in their lives. Professor Einstein, I'd like to come back to you and ask you a question around small business, because small business has demonstrated itself to be one of the potential opportunities to help people establish economic stability and build a path to economic mobility. Almost every mayor identified a lack of personal wealth as a major barrier for their city small business owners of color. And one major contributor to this is the increasing housing costs, which Mayor Schaaf has talked about, and from the perspective of Oakland several times this morning, and the ongoing housing crisis across the country, right? So what are mayors' views on home ownership as a wealth building tool, and what challenges do they see around development and gentrification?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, this is a national issue, right? I think it's particularly acutely felt in places like Oakland or Boston, where I'm living. But we're seeing right now with home prices spiking across the country during the ongoing pandemic that this is a crisis facing many communities. And mayors are really strongly supportive of homeownership as a wealth building tool. So when we look at our data, majorities of mayors actually favor homeownership support programs over rental subsidies. They see increased development as an important tool for improving housing affordability. So majorities of mayors actually think that the production of more market rate housing will increase affordability. And they disagree with the notion of developers as a negative influence in their cities, which actually contrasts pretty sharply with sort of how the public perceives developers. They see developers as a potentially really important partner in producing both market rate and affordable housing. Interestingly, though, a majority of mayors also do not want to see housing prices in their cities decline. And I think that reflects some of the complicated political dynamics around housing policy, that mayors understandably don't necessarily want to take wealth away from existing homeowners, but also understand sort of the crisis that rising home prices create. One particular challenge with increasing housing prices that mayors have highlighted are gentrification pressures. So mayors worry that gentrification pressures could lead to displacement. Majorities of mayors believe that increased home prices in other parts of the city, new amenities and businesses, and developer profit seeking can all lead to gentrification. Interestingly, mayors are particularly worried about the effects of gentrification on renters, with a strong majority concerned about landlords raising rents beyond what the current tenants can afford. And this makes sense that increased housing prices obviously create financial challenge for homeowners as well in the form of things like increased property taxes, but it's a particular challenge for renters who face these sort of immediate threats to housing stability. So that was a lot of data. We asked a lot of different things about mayors and housing because it's such an important issue. But I think the key sort of takeaway is that mayors are really worried about the housing crisis. They're emphasizing homeownership, but they also see really serious threats to renters posed by gentrification.
Mayor Schaaf, I'd love to just bring you right in response to that. As a mayor who's expressed several times in the conversation today a similar frustration to some of the things that were presented in the report, what is the appropriate way to view these findings and to think about fashioning a path forward?
Yeah, well, in Oakland and really in California, we're focused on what we call the 3 Ps: protect, preserve, and produce. So we have very strong rent control, renter protections, protections against harassment, kind of, effective eviction, just cause eviction. We really are trying to keep people from getting displaced because we see that time and time again as resulting in, our children, our elders sleeping on our streets. America should be outraged at this moral failure. Preservation and production means we are trying to convert more of our existing housing stock to protected, affordable housing. Some folks call that social housing. We need a lot more of it to actually be affordable housing for our most vulnerable. Because right now, I have a whole city that is kind of almost to the point of medically disabled, their level of chronic stress over the idea that they cannot keep a roof over the heads of their loved ones. That is not a way to contribute to your society when you live under that constant threat. And finally, I do believe in producing more market rate, all types of housing, and of course, policies like inclusionary zoning and impact fees, which we have. That policy in Oakland allows that, market rate production to help fund more of the social housing. But I want to highlight one cool thing that we're doing in Oakland. One, we are setting aside some of our affordable housing dollars specifically for land trusts. It's a very creative way to help people that otherwise could not afford or qualify to become homeowners to get into that ownership market. And then also something we call keys to equity. Again, because we've used private money, we have been racially intentional to target Black homeowners who were disproportionately affected by the foreclosure crisis in Oakland and throughout the country. And so by identifying Black homeowners who are interested in adding an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU, a granny flat, whatever you want to call it, an extra unit to their property, we are actually helping them build that unit. And we're actually using Black-owned contractors to actually build the units. And that is providing a lot more financial security for that homeowner. It's also providing a affordable place to live for someone in a single family home neighborhood, a neighborhood of opportunity. It's supporting Black contractors. Like, it's just a total win-win-win. And I argue to you, Greg, that mayors like me and Melvin are the ones that see the potentials for these kind of multi-benefit initiatives. So think about all the people that are being served by this initiative, Keys to Equity. It really is phenomenal. But I just get back to, a basic problem, not just with home buying. It's true with access to capital for a small business. It's true with a lot of things. If we don't recognize that the descendants of slaves do not have access to generational wealth the way that others do, and we continue to require things like collateral and credit scores to be the gatekeepers to building wealth, we will never have equity. And it's so important that people see that these types of policies, while not explicitly race-based, really are implicitly race-based. We all have seen the long-term impacts of the racially restrictive covenants in our communities and how those still persist, the impacts of those exclusionary zoning policies that we in government adopted. And there is ample proof that our predecessors were intentional in the racially discriminatory impact of those policies. If anybody reads anything, I think every school child should have to read The Color of Law, because it really does show that we call things, names that we've come to just accept: credit score, collateral, down payment for a house. But the basis for these policies, zoning, the basis for these policies are racially discriminatory.
Wow. Listen, nothing to add there, except I would amplify the fact that race-neutral policies have, in many instances, deepened the divides and left so many others behind. I want to make sure that we leave some time for our audience to ask us some questions. And so, Mayor Carter, I'd love to come to you for the last question for the panel before we take those questions from the audience. And we've talked about a lot here today, right? We've talked about the types of policies that we think will get us from where we are to where we need to be, whether that's guaranteed income or whether that's working on protecting, preserving, and producing housing, whether that's talking about reimagining underwriting and creditworthiness so that small businesses owned by low-wage workers have more access to capital, right, to grow and scale those businesses and create wealth. But nevertheless, what the survey revealed is that when we talk to mayors about the racial wealth gap, they said, yep, we know it's real. And two, not exactly sure how to address it. So I guess the last question I toss out there is, how do we generate even more momentum for action to do the kinds of things that you and Mayor Schaaf have talked about and are implementing in your cities? Do we need more evidence? Do we need more solutions? Do we need more political buy-in? Or what do we need? Do we need more examples of comprehensive plans like we've seen in relation to climate action rather than single policy prescriptions? I wonder if you talk a little bit about, from your vantage point, what you think it will take to move the needle to get us from where we are to where I think we all need and want to be.
Well, that's a huge question, Greg. I like how you slipped that in as like just a couple final thoughts on this global challenge here that we're talking about. What Mayor Schaaf just say cannot be overstated. It is so critical to know that if we today suddenly just say, oh, we want to be race neutral, and know that we're standing on a mountain of race explicit policies that have limited, that have gutted, that have created the status quo that we're navigating today, Look, my grandfather lost over a half dozen commercial properties when our thriving African American community here in St. Paul was uprooted to build a freeway. That story didn't just happen in St. Paul. That story happened all across the country. And the latest number that I've seen is nearly $100 million of wealth stolen from our African American community just here in the city of St. Paul. That doesn't include Oakland. That doesn't include across the country. That doesn't include Detroit. And so we have created the situation there where I think that's one of the most important things that we have to understand. People always ask me, Greg, like, what's one thing that we should do? What's one thing that we can do to help all children? What's one thing that we can do to eliminate disparities? What's one thing that we can? And that's always a crazy question to me because I have kids. And anybody who has kids who they love personally, whose name we know, who I just had one walk out the door to school. And the question is never like, what's one thing I can do to help ensure my child's success? The question is, what's every single thing that we can possibly imagine to help set them up for a great life? And so, to the question that you just asked, is it housing? Is it is it guaranteed income? Is it wealth creation strategies? Is it education strategies? The answer is yes. It is all of those things that resolving these challenges, eliminating those disparities, which, first of all, we have to believe that they can be eliminated. We talk about disparities as though they're an act of God. We talk about homelessness and poverty as though it's an act of God, as though they'll just always be here and they can never be eliminated. But we have to know that they can. And the reason we know that they can is because we created them. If we created them, we can eliminate them. In St. Paul, I'm really proud of the work that we're doing. Like I said, it starts with thinking about fine and fee forgiveness, like library fines, and thinking about all the ways in which our city governments and our community governments are part of the problem. One of the challenges around even guaranteed income is how to ensure families don't get kicked off of their federal and their state-based benefits. But even that challenge is an acknowledgement that our policies that we've create dead ends for families. If families getting $500 a month, more low-income families getting $500 a month to feed their children will actually kick them off of their housing or their health care or their child care type of benefits. That's an example of a policy that's structural inequity. That's a policy that keeps families stuck in the revolving doors of policies. Putting more money in people's pockets through raising the minimum wage, through guaranteed income, through college savings accounts, those types of things. And then thinking about how to build, and this is where we're combining our college savings accounts initiative and our guaranteed income kind of pilot with financial capabilities education to make sure that families know how to make money work for them. That's something that's critical for us as well. None of these things in isolation is going to work in and of itself. And we're putting significant historic amounts of dollars into affordable housing, thanks to American Rescue Plan dollars that we're getting from our federal government. It's not about finding which one of these things is going to kind of be the magic kind of potion for America or the magic potion for St. Paul. It's about how we say we're literally all in around all of these things. How do we do it? By doing it. How do we build momentum? By creating small points of success that we can demonstrate and that we can show. I don't think that we necessarily need more evidence that there's racial impacts on wealth creation in America. I don't know that we necessarily need more evidence that that there's a very strong race effect that's eliminating the prospects for in front of so many American children. What we need is a recognition that what I said earlier, that it's not they, it's we. That when our families can't achieve to their full economic potential, that's a hindrance on our entire city and our entire country, and we need, I think, the political backbone to just say, this is the right thing to do, and we're going to drive forward, and we're going to push it forward, and we're going to bring people along with us, because this is why we're here to do this. This is the work we're here to do in the first place.
Professor Einstein, thank you so much for all that you're doing to ensure that the fundamental tenet of our free society, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, lived deeply with dignity, right, is available not only to those in your communities, but to communities across the country. We have a very little amount of time left, but we did get a couple of questions in from our audience, our guest today. And the first question comes from Somalisa Sahu, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, who's joining us from Germany. Somalisa writes that in Evanston, Illinois, they have led the charge in advancing a conversation and action around paying reparations. Is there any more traction on this issue in cities around the country? I open it up to the panelists if there's someone who wants to provide a quick response.
Well, Katherine, you should remind us again about the change in attitudes about reparations, because just in my own world, I have seen a huge shift where people really dismissed the concept to now are embracing it. The state of California has a reparations process in place right now. Our county has a reparations process in place right now. In Oakland, we're doing it more policy by policy. So for example, when recreational marijuana got legalized in our state, we created a policy that actually prioritized people who had actually marijuana offenses, who had actually been impacted by the criminal justice enforcement of the past laws, which were very racially disparate, as well as people who lived in neighborhoods that saw disproportionate policing. They got extra loans, they got first in line for permits. That's an example of kind of a reparative policy. We also give way more money for street repaving to neighborhoods that have been traditionally neglected in Oakland. So those are some examples of what we're doing. But Katherine, I was really inspired to see the needle move on Mayor's response to that very question.
No, I'd love, Professor Einstein, if you jump in. But right before you do that, I do want to bid Mayor Libby Schaaf adieu. Thank you for joining us today, the 50th mayor of Oakland, California. Mayor Carter and Professor Einstein are going to stick around for the last 2 or 3 minutes. But Mayor Schaaf, again, thank you so much for joining us and for working so hard on behalf of the people of Oakland, California.
Greg, thank you for the opportunity. And I hope everyone heard clearly, we all believe that poverty is policy failure, not personal failure. And the mayors of America are going to change hearts and minds through lifting up these narratives, these incredible families and people that we know in our communities, as well as build this body of evidence to prove the case that racism, systemic racism, is really hurting all of us, our country. It is the most important work that we can be engaged in. And I am so grateful to Rockefeller, because you have been a huge partner for us here in Oakland and cities across the country in really addressing this harm. So thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. And so really quickly, Katherine, I'm going to invite you to respond to our previous question around the shifting attitudes around reparations. And then we have one more question that we're going to toss to Mayor Carter before we close out today's RF break.
Perfect. I don't have a lot to add. I think Mayor Schaaf did a great job of outlining the ways in which reparations programs have become more popular. We've seen more cities, signing on and committing to engaging in some form of reparations pilot programs. So I do think there are some places interested in either replicating Evanston's model or adopting it for sort of different policy areas. It's too early to tell for sure, but my prediction, just sort of knowing public opinion in this area, is I suspect we will see more guaranteed income programs than we will sort of explicit reparations programs. But I think it will be really interesting to watch. And as Mayor Schaaf said, I think this is not necessarily something we would have expected to see emerging even in this sort of smaller subset of cities.
Awesome. And so our last question, Mayor Carter, is for you, and it comes from our good friend, Margaret Bachelor. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. And Margaret writes, what are your strategies for helping Black and Brown entrepreneurs access financial capital?
Oh, that's so critical. That's an exciting question, and I appreciate the question, Margaret. One of the things that we know is that Black and Brown entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs, lack access to capital that other folks do. And that's another space in which that's not just a hindrance on those businesses and those ideas. It's a hindrance on the ability for us to, as a country, to bring new solutions to market. To address some of the challenges that we face. So here in St. Paul, we've created what we call $1 million challenge. We've done that with the local organization to invite businesses owned by people of color into a sort of a pitch contest to be able to, that specifically focuses on communities of color. We're in the process of thinking about how to revamp that in a post-COVID, but we did it a couple of years in a row pre-COVID. One of the things that's important to us as well is thinking about how we do kind of licensing and permitting. We know that we have to be if we're a community where only those folks who have sort of full-time, attorneys and accountants and compliance staff can navigate the process to get a business license or to get a construction permit, et cetera, then that in and of itself will be something that would exacerbate disparities in our community. And then the other piece is thinking about, I think one of the core pieces for us is bringing together the capital, bringing together the sort of critical mass of business leaders and innovators that exists in the city. And there's an enormous amount of them in all of our cities, of people who are sort of thinkers, and bringing those spaces together, helping to make the introductions. Here in Minnesota, we're fortunate that we have a significant number of Fortune 500 companies. So we have a real ecosystem of all the companies that exist based largely on contracts they have to supply those companies. The city's the same way. Our spend has got to be spent equitably in ways that members of our community can equitably access those things. And then the final piece for me is how we think about our city. I always tell folks, if whatever your preconceived notions are about St. Paul are probably 100% true, probably 100 years ago, because people don't necessarily guess that St. Paul's a majority people of color city. People don't necessarily guess that our children in our public schools go home and speak over 100 different languages at home. And as we think about that as the identity of our community, as we think about that as who we are, it gives us access to think differently about the types of businesses that our community should reasonably launch. And so as we create those introductions, as we make those connections, as we count the city's spend in our communities of color and challenge our private market to do the same, we're hopeful that will help us to kind of move the envelope or move the ball, I should say, around access to capital, so that some of those businesses owned by people of color can really find a place to succeed. We've got some really good success stories of businesses that have been launched and built and expanded and got their Series A and series of funding, but we're certainly looking to continue to expand upon that work.
This has been such an excellent RF breakthrough. I want to thank you all again for joining me, and we look forward to continuing to work with you to ensure that the low-wage working people in your communities are able to establish economic stability and find a pathway to economic mobility. Again, thank you, Mayor Melvin Carter, the 46th Mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, Professor Katherine Einstein, Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston University, and thank you to Mayor Libby Schaaf, the 50th Mayor of Oakland, California, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. This was incredible.